Hey everyone, I'm Haifa from GDG Women Tunis, and we are here to talk about AngularJS and to present AngularJS with Matias, a Google developer expert from Toronto. Hello, Matias. Can you please present yourself?
Hello everybody, my name is Matias. I live here in Toronto and I'm a Google developer expert and I work on the Angular core team developing the framework. And today I'm going to teach you guys the basics of Angular and how to get started with it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to teach you the basics of Angular and I'm going to explain how its philosophy works when building websites. And then we're going to code something and you'll see a website come to life with Angular. Okay, so my blog, my Twitter handle, what got me into Angular is Year of Moo. So if you want to get involved with Angular and to see the major parts of Angular, I have a lot of articles that talk about this, and it's a great resource to learn about Angular, and please follow on my Twitter account. And the slides are not working right now, but after the video presentation is done, I'll have the link working properly. That's what the link will be. Okay, so let's talk about web applications first. With the way that websites are built nowadays, they're changing from what they were built with a few years ago. And what are some of the complications? Well, the tricky part with the old school method of building websites is that you have JavaScript modifying HTML. You have JavaScript changing the way the web page loads, and you're giving this dynamic effect, but it's not taking control of the entire web page. And that causes a mixture of HTTP and like regular web pages to load in the wrong way, which causes problems of how websites load. And this all falls onto the server and the way that the server renders the web page. And it's too dependent on the technology. So let's say you're using PHP for a project and then you want to switch over to something else. It requires a lot of work to switch the backend over because it's so tied to the HTML. And all the time is going into the complications of the website. Testing becomes very difficult. And the code is basically useless. It's just way too much work overall. So in the past few years, there's been a sort of a fluctuation of new frameworks in JavaScript that have come to the rescue. And these are known as MVC frameworks, which stands for Model View Controller. And they live in JavaScript. So the idea here is that you have these libraries that give you this foundation to build websites on, and then you use the appropriate HTML code and the appropriate code to make a web page work off that technology. And since everything is structured properly, testing is very easy, organization is very well done, and everyone understands how the web page is built because they understand the technology. Finally, the most important piece is that you can have the backend code, which whether it be PHP or Ruby or Rails or any of that stuff, be completely isolated from the front-end code. So if you want to switch it over, all you have to do is switch the backend to have the same output as to what it was before. And so Angular does this, and it does a lot more. So AngularJS, front-end framework, and what it does is that you have HTML and it extends HTML. It gives you extra possibilities on HTML that you didn't have before to build these complex web applications. All the JavaScript code is organized very well into reusable modules, so you can reuse these bits and pieces wherever you want. And then you have a routing system which ties URLs to your application, so you don't have to implement that on your own. And this nice concept of dependency injection allows for the code to be easily tested. So what are some of the major features of Angular? Well, this dynamic templating system allows you to make HTML tags that don't exist and to use existing HTML code in the way that it's designed. The JavaScript code is very modular, dependency injection, like I said before, the controllers and URL routing, and the system of data scoping where you can pass data into a scope and have it show up on the page. Once we have animation hooks and really good testing support as well. So let's see an example of Angular. Here's what a module looks like, right? And a module, is this JavaScript code that you attach to your page. So, let's go ahead and build this right away. Okay, so I'm going to make a HTML page. Here we have an Angular application. Now, this is a regular HTML file. There's nothing special about this. But in addition to make this work like an Angular app, we have to load AngularJS. I'm going to load the latest version, which is beta 18. And we have our module sitting right here. And then up here, we're referencing that module as my app. So we created a module called angular.module, my app, and we're referencing it right here. So far, this is a regular HTML file. Let's add some functionality to it. So one key component of having a dynamic web page is having the backend code generate backend data. So this would mean that you'd have some sort of value like a username. And depending on what page is being accessed, it's going to show the username or a profile or something like that. So regular HTML isn't designed to do this. How can we make it so it is designed to do this? Well, since we're using Angular, we have this thing called an expression. Whatever we pass in the expression will be printed out into the page, into the DOM of the page. So we haven't defined a username, so let's define one right here. Okay, so I'm defining the username as Matias. Watch what happens now. Second. So notice how the username says my name right now. So if I pass in something like, hello, my username is, we pass a strong tag around it, you can see that the value is getting displayed like that. So Angular, what it's doing is it's rendering the HTML page, it's passing in the data, and it's changing the data on screen. So what we did here is we passed a value of username onto the scope. And the scope in an Angular application is like memory. So whatever we place in the scope can be represented on the page. So let's say that we had another value here. We said age is equal to 200. It's a very old age. And we say I am age years old. See how it says I am 200 years old? That's all data that goes in the scope. Let's see another example. Let's say that in addition to having all that data, we would change it around so that we have a series of items getting displayed as a list. So let's do items is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now let's display those items using something called entry repeat. Now look what happens. We have 5 items on the page. But so far we're just echoing data. There's no interactivity. And this is where Angular becomes very good, because what we can do here is we can add something like a button that when you click it, it adds a new item to the page. So watch what happens now. As I'm adding items to the page, it's adding it to the list. But what if I wanted to remove them? Well, let's add a popping feature. So notice one thing that I'm doing here. I'm using standard JavaScript that comes with, JavaScript. I didn't have to invoke some special wrapper that works with Angular. No, we can just use regular JavaScript. So right here, we're just editing an array. And Angular is smart enough to pick up the changes on the array and render them on the page. So watch what happens now. Adding and popping. Adding and popping. Okay, that's pretty cool. But how can we search for the values? So now if we pass in something like input type text, say ng model is equal to search. Now, if I were to see what that value is on search on the screen, watch what happens now. See, if I'm typing, the value shows up. So this means whatever I type into the input field will get displayed, put onto the scope, put onto the memory of the application immediately. But what I can do with this is I can filter the search results by putting filter search. So the name search matches the filter search. And now, as I'm adding values, I can type in 1, 2, 3, 7. Let's say I go to 10. If I type in 1, you see 1 and 10, all that stuff. Very cool. And then we can add other ones, like order and other filters that we want to add in there. Okay, let's see another feature. Well, another really cool component of Angular is that you have animation support baked in. So we can say Angular animate, we add that in here. And in our module, we add this ng animate module. Now, if I add a class to this, and I call this animated, inside of my HTML code, I can add animated. We could say transition for 5 seconds. And then on the enter, animated, ng enter, start with an opacity of 0, and fade in. So watch what happens now. As we add items, you can see that they're fading in. Pretty cool, huh? Oh, the pop isn't working well. One sec, we forgot to add a leave animation, which is the opposite of enter. So when an item is leaving the page, it will also have an animation. Watch what happens now. Adding items, removing items. Adding items, removing items. We search. You can see all the items that match that search fade in and fade out. This is the basis of how an Angular application works. Let's continue the tutorial. Okay, so we saw how to use modules. Let's take a look at the next bit. So if we wanted to add other parts to the module, we can just hook into the module that we created from before. So let's say that we were to say var app equals that module, and now we want to add something called a filter. And we're going to say even numbers. And in this even numbers thing, we're going to return a function that gets called, and we get back the numbers. And now we want to cycle through all the numbers and return only the numbers that match the even numbers. So how do we do this? We basically have a new numbers array. Then we have a loop that goes through all of the numbers. And now if the number is a even number, then we add into the new numbers array, and we return the new numbers. Now we can access this by putting it right here, putting even numbers. So now we should see only the list of even numbers. So you see we have 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. That's what a filter is. And it's the example provided here. We can also have a run function, and this function is called as soon as the application starts. Very cool. Okay, so let's talk about scope now. So we took a look at scope so far. We were adding bits and parts to the memory of the application. Very cool. But the scope itself can use functions as well. So let's say that we were to have the application start using run, and we provide something called a root scope, which is the top level part of the memory. And in here, if we say root scope items is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we get rid of the existing numbers from up here, that is placed into the memory, but that's placed in the JavaScript code. So if we look at our application again, it works as expected. But we can, in addition to providing basic data structures as arrays and numbers and strings, we can also use functions. So let's say that we had this defined as a local variable. We can return this as a function. So we say return items. And now, and up here, we can say get items as a function. So get items. And this works the same as before. Very cool. So anything that you place in the scope can be represented into the HTML code. So we took a look at, for example, we had our username, and now we're adding these functions of putting in numbers into the page. So we have items that push. Let's say that we had something like add item, and we had something like remove item. So we just do root scope. Root scope, remove item equals function. Same as before, exactly the same. You're adding and removing, you're pasting things on the scope, and it can be represented in the HTML code. Very cool. So it's basically the memory of the application. Okay, let's continue. So the problem is problem with this is that as you're adding data into the scope, it's being represented in the HTML code, right? But you can have a child scope, which is a section of the HTML code that you add in. And if we pass data into the scope, we can represent that scope in a subscope. Okay, so let's see how that works. So now, if we do something like div, and we use a controller, so we say div ng controller, we call this one test controller, and we were to sort of place all of the stuff that we created so far inside of a test controller, what we can do here is we can say controller test CTRL, and we get back a local scope value. And now when we're adding data onto that scope, it's going to function in its own contained environment. So if I were to say duplicate this code, we have two test controllers. Now you'll notice that if I'm adding into one, the other one's not getting affected. So this is the idea of having multiple scopes. So this controller sets up its own scope here, and this controller sets up its own scope here. Very cool. Let's continue. So we took a look at controllers, and the controller is just a block of logic that deals with data. And you can add data, you can pull data from a server, and so on. And we define a controller with a test controller like that, and then we referenced it using ng controller. But what about routing? What about if we want to have a separate page for one page and a separate page for another page? So if we pass in a module called ng-route, so in here, if we take the, say that we take this and we add an Angular route, and then we use that as a dependency, so we say ng-route. Now we can start defining a bunch of routes for our application. So we say config, function, route provider, and we say route provider when the root page is accessed, load this data. We say home controller. And then in addition, load this URL, we'll say home.html. Very cool. Now let's have another page that says info, or say items. Then we have our items controller. We're going to put this as items. So let's rename this right here and call this items controller. And let's create an HTML file. And we'll call this items.html. And now, if we were to copy and paste the code that we had before, pass it in here, change this to items controller. Or no, we can get rid of this right here. And let's say we add a heading here that says items page. And now, all we have to do in here is we have to say div ngView, and all the views are going to get loaded in there. But there's one final thing we have to do. We have to make a home page. We'll just say home page. We'll add a link. We'll say it's going to go to the items page. Click here to view the items page. Okay. Double check that we're not missing anything. We've defined our routes. We need to define a home controller. Let's make an empty controller for now. Okay. So now when we access this page, we can see it says click here to jump to the items page. I click on it. You can see the URL changes. See how it says items up here? And we're back to this items thing. But if I go back and I go forward, there are two different pages that are loaded depending on the URL. This is how routing works in Angular. See how we included ng-route, and then we had a route provider, and then we defined our routes in here, and then we have the associated controllers. So what about the HTML? Once again, we passed in the ngView element. We loaded Angular as well as Angular route, and that showed up properly. Okay, so now the real stuff comes into Angular when you start loading in data into your application and representing it inside of your template. How do you do that? Well, we use various things called directives, and we've already used something like ng-repeat, for example. If we go to the items page, we're repeating a list of data depending on what's on the scope. But what else is there? So ng-repeat will repeat a list of values. So this example right here is showing a series of colors, right? And we have our colors in the scope, and then we have a function called toManyValues. But there's also other things such as ngIf. So let's try to replicate this knowledge here. Let's have a div ngIf, and let's say that getItems.length is greater than or equal to 10. And then let's have another ngIf below, which is the opposite, that says is less than 10. So now we're going to have a message here that says you have too many numbers. Let's go back to our application. Let's reload this page. So watch what happens when I start adding in too many things. You see I have too many numbers. The list isn't being shown. But when I remove things, it goes back. So this ngIf expression is getting matched whenever new data is added into the scope. What else can we add to our template? Well, let's see. Let's say ng-include. Let's say that we have this message in a separate HTML file. So we have this error.html. We add that in there. And let's say that we only keep the message in here. So if that expression is true, we say div ng-include error.html. So now you can see the application works as before. But if we look at what's happening in the inspector, we can see that when we add too many things, it downloads another HTML file from the server and renders it on the page. So this is what ng-include does. And you can also place ng-include on the same element as the ngIf. Okay, very cool. Does it work the same as before? Yes, it does. So most of these directives, you can mix and mash them together. Okay, let's continue then. ng-show and ng-hide. So ngIf is the same thing as ng-show, but the difference is that the element will not be put into the DOM if it's false. But with ng-show and ng-hide, it'll simply be displayed and hidden. So if we pass something like this, for example, let's go back to what we had before. We change this to ng-show, and we change this one to ng-hide. What we can do is we can change the expression around. So this is going to hide when there's too many items, and this is going to show when there's too many items. So let's see this one more time. It's showing. But if we look in the inspector, we can see that this element is here because it's showing, and this one's not showing because it has the ng-hide class, which automatically sets to display as none. But the cool thing with Angular is that we can animate this as well. So we hop into here, we go to the animated portion, we say show hide, and let's say we add a transition for this one. And let's say that we basically hide and show this by saying that it's display block, use a box sizing so that we don't have to deal with padding. And then we say that the max height is going to go from 0, and we're going to go to say 100 pixels. And then when it's hidden, we're going to go to 0 pixels. Hopefully this works. Let's try it out. And we have to add this right here, this show hide class. Right here is show hide. Okay. We're adding. No, kind of works, almost. Let's say that we pass an opacity. Oh, I forgot one thing. Overflow hidden. Let's see if it works now. So we have this cool animation effect, which is showing and hiding certain portions. So that's how you can tap in animations as well. Very cool. So once again, show is only visible when the expression is true. Hide is the opposite. Okay, so how can we actually download data from a server and display it on the screen? So you use this service called HTTP, and that's going to load in data from a server. All right. Let's say that we wanted to say download something from the GitHub API. Actually, let's say we want to download something from the YouTube API. So we say we just go to the YouTube API. Let's download that. All right. Actually, I'm going to use another Angular website that was built. In here, we can figure out the AJAX request. Let's take a look at the network, see what it's downloading. And it looks like it's downloading from this most popular link. Let's copy this over. And let's pass this into Angular right here. So for this items page, let's get rid of the numbers. And in here, let's inject a service called HTTP. And HTTP is going to call this URL. So we're going to do var URL equals this. Let's get rid of all this other stuff that gets created. And we're just going to call URL. And then on success, we have the data. And let's pass in a console log just to inspect the data as it comes in. And let's get rid of these values that add data onto the screen. Okay, so that's all we have so far. Let's go back into our template code. Let's remove the buttons. Let's keep our search, but let's remove these error messages that are displayed and go back to having a simple repeater. Okay, so let's see what happens now when we go to this page. So right now, it looks like the data was downloaded properly. Yep, it was. Okay, let's inspect that data. What data did we get back? Got back a feed, and a feed has a series of data. Cool, so HTTP automatically downloaded that data. So if we go into entry and we look at this data, so what we can do here is we can say that, scope.videos is equal to data feed entry. And now in here, we can start to cycle through each of these things, and let's look at the JSON value for each of the data that was returned. Let's see if this works. Okay, not working yet, almost there. Oh, it's because it's videos, so we have to change this to videos. Does this work yet? Nope, not yet. Seems like there's a bug on line 59. I see, okay, let's filter. Let's get rid of the filter from before and only show what we need to. So you see how all this JSON data was downloaded from the server, right? So we have, we have the thumbnail image, for example. Actually, no, this looks like the ID, my mistake. So, let's represent the ID for each one of these. So we have .id and we have $T. So now we see a bunch of YouTube IDs on the page. And then let's say that we wanted to provide a link to click on each one of these. So if we use something like ngref, we pass that expression value and we display it again. But let's say that we wanted to have more data. So to inspect what we can find, I'm going to put a debugger right here. And now, as the page loads, I'm going to inspect the details of that data. So if I type in scope.videos, and now in here, I can look at something like, say, the title. The title has that as well. So I can say that title like that. And then I believe that there's also a thumbnail somewhere in here. So media group and media thumbnail. So let's pass in img ng src is equal to item media $group media $thumbnail 0 and then URL. Let's see if this loads properly. And refresh. Oh, almost there. The data load properly. Oh, I forgot the closing curly braces. So we have a series of thumbnails loaded from YouTube. So all we did here is we connected to the YouTube server. We asked to download the data using this HTTP service. The data was downloaded. Now we have a series of videos, and when you click on them, it's going to go to the video page. Very cool. Let's continue. So there's also a system called $resource, which does a lot more of this for you for RESTful services. So if you're trying to connect to a backend that uses REST, you can definitely use $resource, and that will help you out a lot. I'm not going to go through $resource here, but there's plenty of Angular articles that teach this. Okay, so now let's talk about directives. So we've used ng-repeat, and ng-repeat doesn't exist in HTML. Instead, it's a special HTML element that was created by Angular, and this special HTML element is known as a directive. Okay. You guys are still there, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, I'm continuing. Okay, so we have these directives, and these directives do special things in HTML. But we're limited by the amount of directives that we already have. So how can we do more? And the way that we can do more is by having our own directives. So the way that the syntax of this is .directive. So a good example of this is, let's say that we had a directive called app directive YouTube thumbnail, right? And let's say for this thumbnail, all we're going to do is we're going to display the image accordingly, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a template, and this template is just going to have the same img tag as before. So we're going to copy this over, and it's going to show it, so we're going to do that. But instead of having something crazy like this, let's just do thumbnail. And then in here, what we can do is we can examine the video that was provided. So if we do something like var video equals adders video, and we use scope.eval to get that value, then what we can do is we can say that scope.thumbnail is equal to this whole long video thing of that. So all we're doing is a YT thumbnail that's going to render this into the page. So this link function is called when the Angular comes across this directive and it compiles into the page, and it's going to put an image inside of that link, inside of that thumbnail, and it's going to show it. Let's see if this works. And this one right here is going to be YT thumbnail. So let's see. So now, instead of having that big image thing, we can just say div YT thumbnail, and then we pass in the item. Does this work? Let's see. Okay, it works. But if we look at the HTML code here, notice how we have a YT thumbnail, and then it created this image inside of it accordingly. So this is a directive. Now we can also have something like YT link, and then we can pass in this as well. So we say item. So now inside of our code, let's make another directive. We call this YT link. And in here, we're going to pass an image, gref, and we're going to say link. And then in here, we're just going to show what the link is. We're going to show the title is. And we're going to close that off. So in here, we get the video just like we did before, but we're going to call this YT link. And then we say scope dot link is equal to ID T, I believe. And the title is equal to the title. So we pass those title values in here, and it's going to create this link for us. Let's see how this looks. Okay, something is missing from here. Let's take a look. Property YT of undefined. YT link. Let's put a debugger here. Let's quickly examine what I'm missing. Oh, there's no dollar in front of, okay, my mistake. Okay, the title's showing up properly, and we can see the link to the page. Very cool. Let's continue. So this is a large example of a directive, and here we're calling it mySpecialElement. We have our own data on the scope that we pre-fill. So this directive has its own scope, and it has this value called times. We're loading a template into the page. You can also provide a controller if you want to have extended stuff happen on the directive, and you have a link element where you can attach event listeners. Now notice how we're doing something called scope apply. What scope apply does is that when you have an event listener, when you have anything that's asynchronous, it has to sort of reestablish itself with the Angular app, and it has to kickstart Angular to notice the changes. So this is why we've used directives like ngClick or ngFocus or its own routing system, because Angular handles that in its own code, but sometimes when we create our own things, we have to call apply on our own. Okay, so now that we understand, how we can render things onto a screen properly, let's talk about testing for a second. So notice how in the index file, notice how here I'm passing an Angular route, Angular animate. There's another file, and this file is called Angular mocks. When you load this into your testing architecture, you can basically write unit tests while having this mocks file. And then you can use Jasmine or Mocha because it supports that, and you write a test like this, where you basically write your spec out, and then you inject the services that you want, and then you can provide your assertions. So what Angular mocks does allows you to provide these injectable services. So if I were to say go like this, app service, or sorry, app factory, and we'll call this YouTube request. It's called YT request, and we load this HTTP service, and we take this code right here, we put this right here. So we're basically abstracting the request that we downloaded from the server, and then we can put it, instead of loading in $HTTP, we can load in YT request, and that works the same way. So we have this contained service called a YT request, but notice how we can include it into another piece of code in this controller. That's known as dependency injection, and these services are defined in that way. So when it comes to unit testing, you basically write your code into services, and then you inject them into your tests, and then you place assertions on the test. There's also something called E2E testing, which uses something called protractor. These slides are a little bit out of date, but there's something called protractor, which lets you do that, where you can basically navigate to a page and check to see if certain things loaded accordingly. Now, this basic tutorial is not going to cover protractor unit testing, but those are available on my website on yearofmu.com, and there's plenty of videos on egghead.io that explain how to do that. Okay, so we talked about animations so far, and the way you have to do it to work is you have to pass an ngAnimate and load in the Angular animations code. And any of the ng directives, ngRepeat, ngIf, ngShow, ngClass, all these support animation hooks. And you do the same way with JavaScript animation. So CSS, we would add in these familiar looking classes like we did before, and you have to define a transition. But you can also pass in a keyframe, you can also pass in a keyframe animation. So instead of using transition, you can pass an animation directly. And then you can also do a JavaScript animation where, just like how we define config or factory, you can define .animation and then pass in the enter and leave events to define a JavaScript-oriented animation. Cool. So some of the things that I missed in this presentation is I didn't talk about the promise API. And it's not $promise, it's actually $Q. But the idea here is that notice how we don't have any callbacks. So you notice this code right here, for example, this YT request. Normally with JavaScript, you'd have to have some function that gets called. So with promises, you have this chain of things that can be called. So you can say, .then. So a series of functions will get called when the process is resolved. So that's something to check out. It's really baked well into the framework. Form validation, which is also huge in Angular, where you can write really cool forms that add and remove properties very easily. and scope events so that you can detect when certain changes happen across the application, and more about testing. Here are some helpful resources to get you going along with Angular. Go to their website. The documentation is getting better each day, and there's good guides on there to teach you how to do things. Eggheaded.io, it's the best screencasting website that teaches Angular, and there's also a really good tutorial by a programmer named Dan Whalen who explains Angular in an hour, just like I did here, but he's going to go over a lot of other things in Angular, including diagrams and everything else. And here is a cool GitHub URL that teaches how to look at Angular right from the beginning and all the resources to get started. Europemoo.com, my website, and that's it for my presentation, and thank you everybody who attended and watched, and please follow and feel free to contact me at my address.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. So we have some questions. Before we gonna start with Nihal, have you a question, Nihal?
I just want to ask if we want to use multiple views in the same page, how we proceed.
Okay, so with the current view system with ng route, that isn't possible in an easy way. There's something called UI router, which does encourage how to do that with their code. Like it tells you in the tutorial how to do that. And by the fall, there will be a new routing system in Angular, hopefully, that does this in a much easier way. So for now, use UI router.
Okay, and if we use, we want to delete an item from our table, and this item, before we delete it, we have a message that say if we want to delete it, we have to confirm it, or else we have to cancel it. But if I put it in ng repeat, I have I get this message as much as the numbers of items. So how I can fix this?
Okay, so if I'm going to share my screen quickly. So typically when you run into situations when you have something repeating and you want to delete something, you would pass in, div, I believe you can pass in the same elements, you pass in ng controller, and then you'd say, record controller, and then you pass in something like record equals, in this case, item. And then what you could do here is, so we go back to the controller code, you can say app.controller record controller, and then you inject adders so you can get a hold of that item as well as scope. So we say that var item is equal to adders record scope eval. So now we have the item. And then on the scope you can pass in stuff like remove, for example. And then in here you would have some sort of, confirmation thing. So you'd be like scope.confirm equals true. And then you'd have if scope.confirm, then you actually remove it. But you would do something like, item dot, destroy, or you would say scope.emit to tell the previous controller to remove it. So you'd say remove item. And then what that will do is in the previous controller, so in this case items controller, you would do scope on remove and then remove it. But the point with this is that you have your own controller here where you can remove things very easily. And this confirmation message would just be something like ng click remove, and then you'd have something like this span ng if it's not confirmed, remove, and then you'd have sorry. Okay, so there we go. So right now it's saying that if it's not confirmed, remove it, and then it gives you 2 more buttons. It says, you know, are you sure? Yes and no, and then it calls the remove again, which then tells the previous controller to remove it. So this is kind of how I would do it. Now there's a recording with this, so take a look at the recording after and see if you can get it to work.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ahlem,
Okay.
have a question?
Mm-hmm.
So I have 2 questions. First one about the compatibility with other browsers.
Okay.
With Chrome and
So Angular 1.2 works with Internet Explorer 8 and above, and all other browsers. And Angular 1.3, which is the new version coming out, only works with Internet Explorer 9 and above. And the reason why we did it with this browser and above is because there's new features and newer browsers that we can't do unless we drop Internet Explorer 8. So if you want to support IE 8 and above, use 1.2. If you don't mind having newer browsers only, then support IE 9 and above on Angular 1.3.
Okay, the other one from Hamdi. He asked about the GDE program of GDE. How to become a GDE, and if there is an application when we can apply for it.
To become a GDE?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if there's a way to apply directly. I've only been a GDE for a very short period of time. However, I got nominated, so one way which I got involved is to produce a lot of material, teach a lot of Angular, or teach stuff about Google that you're passionate about. And if somebody who works at Google notices you, then they can enroll you into the process, and that will help you out a lot when you have a lot to show. So even if you apply and you get an interview, you still need to have a lot of things that you've done for the technology, like blogging or making videos or teaching. So if you're already doing that, then you know, try to spread the word, and that will hopefully get you to become a GDE. Okay, any other questions?
Now it's okay for me.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here with us, and hope to see you again.
Okay, I'll post a link to the slides shortly, and if you could put that on the Google Plus page, that would be good.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.